Hi everyone, I'm thriller author j.f.penn, and today on Killer Thriller TV I'm interviewing Zoe Sharp, author of the best-selling and award-nominated thrillers featuring Charlie Fox, ex-Special Forces turned bodyguard, compared to many to Lee Charles' Jack Reacher, which is brilliant, and I love Zoe's book, so very excited to have you on the show, Zoe.
I'm excited to be here.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is Charlie's voice, because it's first person, obviously, but Charlie's voice is very clear in your books, and I know that that's not necessarily you as a person, it's the character, but how did you find that voice as a writer, as it's something that people really struggle with?
A lot of it is, as Stephen King said, write, 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 or read, 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 write, write, write. You just have to keep going, and reading stuff out loud is one of the best ways to discover a voice, because not only reading it out loud, but getting somebody else to read your work out loud back to you. Because if you're reading your own stuff, you know where the pauses go, you know where the emphasis should be, even if it isn't actually written on the page. Whereas if somebody else is reading it, they can only go from what you've written. So they can only put the pauses in where you force them to pause, and they can only put the emphasis where you show there should be emphasis. So I find that the most useful thing. But it was weird. I sat down to write the Charlie Fox novella, having been working on edits on a couple of other books, on different books. And as soon as I started to write Charlie again, that voice came back very quickly. And it's interesting that it's all part of the character. And it's sort of slightly dry, slightly laconic style that is just her thought process.
And I mean, because I've read one of your more recent ones, and I must say I get the titles a bit wrong. I've read Fifth Victim, and I've read the first one. And what amazed me is that even your it was your first book, right? And the voice is just as strong in the first book as it is in the later books. So did you get that straight away? Was that so clear to you at the beginning? It just seems amazing to me that the first book at this strong voice of the character.
I tried for a long time to write it in third person, and it just didn't work. And as soon as I started writing in first person, even though really for a sort of crime novel, it's more difficult because you can only introduce information that your main character or your narrator can logically have gained themselves. So it does give you a lot of, a lot of restrictions in some ways, but the character came so clearly in first person that it just hadn't been working in third at all. So I stuck with first person all the way through.
Yeah, and it's really good. And another question on series. I mean, you're on 10, 11 plus novellas. Like,
Yes.
What are your tips on writing a series and keeping everything? Like, do you have a series Bible? How do you remember everything?
I have to keep opening up old files and doing word searches and saying, what time of year was it? I do tend, when I'm writing each book, to do a summary as I go. And that helps because then I've got the summary afterwards. So every time I finish a chapter, I just jot down a note of what day it is, not day of the week particularly, but day one, day two, whether the chapters follow on immediately or whether there's a time break, whether it's day or night. If the character's carrying any injuries, because it's very easy for them to be limping in one chapter and then miraculously restored to health in the next. So I keep that, and that actually helps when I'm then looking back, because I've got that very brief précis of the entire book that I can work out, and it's also very useful for editing afterwards as well, because I do all my alterations on the summary and then go to work on the main typescript itself.
So that's almost a synopsis while you're writing it.
As I'm writing, because they're usually different from the outline, because all my outlines have E and OE at the bottom, because inevitably you start writing and things change. Characters don't behave as you hope they would. I had one character in one of the books who I was going to be the villain. I didn't like him. He was going to be the villain, and when I actually came to it, he hadn't done it, and I couldn't frame him, so I had to get somebody else to have done it instead. and that changed the whole course of the book. So yeah, the outlines end up with a lot of scribble and pencil lines on them, whereas the summary is actually what happens in the book, and I find that much more useful. So then I can go back, particularly to know, well, I finished the last book, and you inevitably in the next one you're making references to what happened 3 months ago or last year or last winter, and remembering that and keeping that in line is very useful. I did almost end up with a 9-day week in one of the books, but fortunately an eagle-eyed editor caught on that one, so we rescued it.
Which is brilliant. And when you wrote the first book, did you know it was going to be this bigger series?
I knew I had at least sort of 3 or 4 stories. I knew I wanted to take Charlie in a progression, because she's not a bodyguard in the first book. She's come out of the army. She got thrown out of the army basically in disgrace. And I started the first book at the point where she turns the corner from being a victim to deciding she's going to take control of her own destiny. So when she comes under threat again in the first book, in a vaguely similar way to the threat she had in the army, instead of caving in, she fights back. And that's where I wanted to start her journey. But it took another, I think, it was only book 3 before she was actually training to be a bodyguard.
Yeah.
So I always knew that that's where I was going to take her, into that line of work, because there aren't that many jobs that, I mean, she's been through Special Forces training. There aren't that many jobs that ex-Special Forces soldiers can fall into very easily in civilian life. They're very badly prepared when they come out of the forces for returning to civilian life.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, and some of the things you've mentioned there, and the self-defense and the travel and everything. How hardcore is your research process for each book?
well, I try not to, do too much that's going to hurt. But I like to do an awful lot of research and then leave probably 90% of it out. The internet is absolutely fabulous for finding out information, but it's even better for finding the right person to talk to, and actually going and talking to somebody who has been there and done that is invaluable. There's no substitute for it, because they really know the subject, and they also know the little tweaks and the shortcuts and the things that you don't find out if you're looking at the official line a lot of the time. So, I mean, when I wrote the first book, part of it revolves around working on club doors. And I actually talked to a guy who'd run nightclubs and another guy who'd worked a lot of club doors. And the kind of stuff he told me, I would have loved to have put in the book, but nobody would have believed that it went on.
That's awesome. So it's good to hear you do a lot of that research. Now, another thing that I've been really interested in your development. The first book set in Lancaster, right, in England, and the more recent books are in the US. Was that a marketing decision around reaching the US audience, or was that just a progression of interest?
Well, a little bit of both. I must admit that my previous US publisher picked the book up picked the series up at book 4, which was the first one I'd set in the States. And said, we really like this, and we'd really like another one, and we'd like it to be set in America. This is only a suggestion, but let's not forget who's making it. So I said, yeah, okay, I can do that. And so the next few books were set in the States. Now, that actually has been very useful, because Charlie is working as a bodyguard. She's involved with firearms, and there is not the opportunity for that in the UK. It's very, very restricted, if it's allowed at all, even for, official bodyguards. So it was useful to be able to have her, have that ability to work with, go play with guns, basically. But the next book is going to be back in Europe, the next one in the series. The novella is set in an earthquake zone, and I haven't actually at this stage specified where it is, but there's been a major earthquake and she's thrown into the middle of it.
Ah, fantastic. Well, New Zealand, might we?
Well,
not quite Europe.
could be sort of Haiti, New Zealand. It's a sort of combination
Japan.
of a lot of those sort of areas.
Yeah. Oh wow,
So
that's very cool. And how have you found it in general as a British author trying to reach the American market?
uh, it's been very interesting getting into the American market, and a lot of the American readers do absolutely love Charlie.
Mm.
Um, I had to fight initially to stop one of the publishers trying to Americanize the character too much, because I've kept her very firmly as British. And that's another aspect actually of setting a British character in the States. The first thing was I didn't want to write from inside the head of an American character, because I am a Brit, and although I've spent a lot of time in the States, I do still live in the UK. So I wanted to keep her as a British character, and also it means she's looking at the place very slightly as an outsider. And that's been always been her sort of attitude. She's almost always looked at life as a slightly as an outsider.
Mm.
And therefore it kind of adds to the whole air of the character, I think.
Mm.
And she still finds certain aspects of the States amusing. You know, she gets into an elevator and sees the maker's name is Schindler. And to her, that's really funny because it's Schindler's Lift. But the Americans don't understand that as a joke at all.
Yeah, and but I mean, more specifically, as you as an author, have you had to specifically like you're going to BoucherCon, which is in the US? Have you specifically gone to network in America? You know, and would you advise that for other non-US authors trying to make it with the Americans as such?
There is no substitute for going and actually meeting people.
Mm.
And I know that's, you know, a very time expensive, I
Yeah.
suppose, way of doing it. But you do meet a lot of booksellers, you meet reviewers, you meet people at the BoucherCon event, which is one of the biggest mystery conventions, I think, in the world.
Mm.
So it's always been incredibly useful, and I've made some amazing friends amongst authors by going to BoucherCon. You
Mm.
know, I first met Lee Child at a BoucherCon event.
Mm.
I think I first met Jeffrey Deaver when he was at the first Thriller Fest. You know, so I get to meet the people who are the writers I admire, the people I'm really, you know, interested in reading, and I get to meet an awful lot of readers and mingle, and it's
Mm.
great.
Yeah,
It's a really
I'm
good
with you.
experience.
I'm with you on that. I met those guys at Thriller Fest too, and it was amazing. It's just like wow, it's brilliant. So it is difficult but worth it. Now I also want to ask you about publishing because you are, I guess, what we're calling now a hybrid author.
Yes.
And you combine traditional publishing with self-publishing, indie publishing. You know, what do you think about the current state of the market? You know, what's your personal, I guess, plan as an author with the way things are?
There are still certain advantages in traditional publishing. I think when you're first starting out,
Mm.
it does give you a bit of an advantage with the networking that traditional publishers have. On the other hand, there are an awful lot of authors who are with very big, very well respected traditional publishing houses who are not getting any kind of special attention, they're not getting any kind of special push, and therefore, are they really seeing any advantage in being with a traditional publishing house?
Mm.
I took back control of my backlist
Mm.
and put that out independently, which was about the first 4 or 5 books in the Charlie Fox series, coming up for 2 years ago now. And the effect that had in revitalising, you know, the later books in the series was absolutely amazing. It was the best thing I'd done in years. It's enabled me to look at going into other genres, perhaps, that I would not normally be able to do because I was discouraged in the past from doing it because I was told, you're a crime author, you know, therefore you must write crime.
Mm.
And I've been working on a supernatural thriller,
Oh.
which I'm going to be doing some more rewrites on over the winter. But I wouldn't have been able to do that, I think, if I'd stayed solely in the traditional publishing sort of field. So yes, it does give you a lot more freedom. I mean, it's tough, but then publishing is tough. Somebody told me years ago, you think when you get your first book accepted that it's like winning the lottery. They said, actually, all you've won is a ticket to another lottery. So, and yeah, that's very true. I think So a lot of it is luck. This seems to be one of those weird businesses where it doesn't necessarily follow that if you write something that's absolutely brilliant, it's going to be a runaway success. There are all sorts of other factors, but as an independent author, you can influence a lot of those other factors a lot more, I feel. And people say, you have to be lucky, but the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Yeah, and also it's longevity. I mean, you're on X number of books now, and I only discovered you and Charlie Fox a few months ago.
Yeah.
When I met you at a festival, and it was kind of, I think, the more books you have out there, the better, right? And I also wanted to ask you about this because I see you're also playing with form. You've got novellas, you've got short stories out now on Kindle, haven't you, as well? How have you found that those? I would say they're still experiments, right? We just don't know at the moment how those really work because it's new, but have you found that they seem to be bringing new people in?
Yes, I think they do. I mean, the first thing I published myself when I went into the whole, very wide-eyed and trepidatious into the whole self-publishing thing was I put together a short story ethology called Fox 5 because I knew I'd already got 4 short stories that involved Charlie Fox that kind of followed the spread of her before she was a bodyguard and then working as a bodyguard. So I knew that would give somebody a very good introduction to the character. So I then wrote another, quite a long, about a 12,000 word short story and added that to the mix with an introduction to the character and some information about the rest of the series. And I put that out, and that did, remarkably well for gaining new interest. So I then put all those stories out separately in case somebody wanted to read them on their own. And I've since put out all the other short stories I've got. So that was very useful. And I've just put out a new one as well that has quite a big chunk of the new book, The Blood Whisperer, in the back of it. So I'm hoping that somebody will like the short story and then read, I think it's all, the first about 22% of The Blood Whisperer, so they can get a really good feel for the new book.
And it's a great marketing tactic, I think. Really good. And last question, which I was reading some interviews with you, and there was a quote, and you said that you find writing hard, and yet what you've just talked about, you've just given us oodles of examples of all the different things you're writing, and yet writing is hard. So how do you discipline yourself to write? Are you one of those writers who likes having written? Is that kind of the point? And how do you discipline yourself?
Well, there is a little bit of that. I mean, I tend to self-edit as I go along. So I write and then I go back over it and I read it and I edit it and I fiddle with it. So, and I am a bit of a perfectionist. And therefore it is hard. And I always have this feeling in the back of my head that if ever I find it too easy, then I'm not doing it well enough. Because I hope rather that I don't see myself as an artist, I see myself as a craftsman, and I'm always trying to improve that craft. And therefore you have to worry about what you do and you have to work hard at what you do. Otherwise you're just dashing off the latest book. And, that's not being fair to the reader, because I don't want to read something that feels like that wonderful phrase, the contractual obligation book.
Yeah.
And, I certainly don't want to write something that feels like that. So I'm always striving and worrying. And, even when you've finished a book, you think, I have no clue whether this is good, bad or indifferent. And it isn't until the book actually gets out there and you start getting the initial feedback that you maybe start to think, well, perhaps it isn't quite the pile of rubbish that I thought it was when I'd just finished.
No,
and everybody goes through that.
Yeah, it's true. But no, they're fantastic books. I'm a real fan. Really love Charlie and the series, and I'm going to try your new stuff. So let everybody know where they can find you and your books online.
Right, they can go to my website, which is zoesharp.com. There are the bookshelf pages on there, which have all the links to everywhere the books are available in all the different formats, so large print, audio, ebook, and the printed versions. I'm also on Twitter at author Zoe Sharp, and I'm on Facebook as well as Zoe Sharp. So, and as I think we've already mentioned, I have a very lowbrow sense of humour. So, don't go and look at my Facebook pages if you're easily offended.
It's a lot of fun, just like the books.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so thanks so much, Zoe. That was brilliant.
Thank you.